John, could you explain who you are and your background for us?
Professionally, I used to be a diplomat, a Canadian diplomat, a diplomat with the United Nations. I've specialized my whole life really on the Middle East. Partly it's because that's where I come from, that's the cultures that I know, but it's also was my passion and my interest. The Middle East, its politics, its culture, where it's going, and tragically its conflicts. And the more I worked in, let me call it traditional diplomacy, meaning official diplomacy, with the Canadian government or with the United Nations, the more dissatisfied I was with what we were doing. This was primarily motivated because somehow I just really cared to see how the Middle East could get better, not simply push ahead one agenda. Maybe that was a bit idealistic of me, but that was the way I was. So what I did is I ended up leaving traditional classical diplomacy and building another kind of career, and a career that's now described as being in conflict resolution. So now I've become a mediator, somebody who does what's termed diplomacy or mediation between conflicted parties, nations or groups that are literally fighting. I do that on an informal basis. And so that's where I've come to with my work.
What was the problem with your diplomatic world? What was blocking you from doing things?
Sure. First of all, as you can imagine, whenever you work for a large institution or a government, it's going to be rigid. Those institutions or governments tend to work for their own systems, their own purposes, their own regulations, rather for the world outside.
So it's mutual back-scratching and that sort of thing.
There's a lot of that. There's a lot of status seeking as people are trying to rise up their hierarchy. There are not only instances, but there are some systems are more efficient than others. Some pursue their interests in a much more effective fashion than others. But that's not even really the only issue that bothered me. Although, frankly, I'm just simply not a very good bureaucrat. Which would, I guess, have made me a terrible diplomat ultimately, because diplomats have to work with headquarters. They have to work with their bureaucracies. The reason I never bought onto it fully is I thought that our work in politics and diplomacy and international relations wasn't attending to a huge segment of human motivation. That was what really struck me, is diplomacy comes out of a long tradition of dealing with state interest, which is certainly valid, but it tends to be quite material and power-oriented.
It's top-down instead of individual-based.
It's top-down. It's usually pursuing some kind of clear interest, which is not unimportant. I'm not trying to diminish that, such as an economic interest or power and control. Fine, I accept all that, and the world needs all that to run to some degree. But it seemed to me there was a whole other pack of motivations going on that were not being addressed. They were either being ignored or actually abused.
What sort of motivations?
Right, and this is what took me ultimately to being very interested in the human givens approach. These motivations are, in my view, first of all, they're intangible. They're not so easy to grab onto, because they are motivating us to do something, and we're usually focused on the doing something rather than why. They're usually, in my view, and this is the learning that I went through throughout my career, they're primarily emotional motivations. You can have material motivations. People need food, water, a home, that's clear. They can even become greedy on that level and pursue that too much. But I think the dimension that needs so much more work, and this is really what I'm very interested in pursuing, developing, I'm part of this learning process myself, is to have a much better grip on all forms and manifestations of emotional motivations in politics, in diplomacy, and in international relations. Now these, I find the human givens approach useful because it identifies them quite clearly. And they're sort of the atomic level of emotional motivation from which we can take it and scale it up to the political.
So those who are ruling our lives in politics and those whose lives are being managed should all operate according to the same group of needs. Is that what? Well,
this is the ideal scenario. Now, it's going to be quite honest, it's going to take a while until that's absorbed. Hopefully, as little time as possible because of the importance of these needs, and we can talk about why they're important and what happens when when these ideas aren't being absorbed. But yes, you have described what I would consider to be the ideal scenarios. These have become so fundamental in many cultures that they're automatically referred to or built into behavior patterns. The situation is actually more difficult than that. There are no politics without human motivations happening. They're there, but they're not identified, and worse than that, they're quite often hijacked. Clever leaders know how to manipulate them. They have an instinct for them. We see that all around us. We can take actual living examples even today. Leaders of major countries who know instinctively what will get people to follow them. Extremist groups and heavily ideological groups also do it. They package things in a way that looks very appealing, which is why they get many recruits. The recruits will follow them, and frankly, and there's a lot of evidence for this, then those recruits are getting a whole pack of emotional needs met. Now, unfortunately, the goals of those groups could be quite destructive. And the deep secret, which I see all the time, especially in the Middle East, is that the more effective any group or any leader is at packaging the emotional motivations, the more effective they will be at getting their ends met. The problem is if we don't know what those needs are more explicitly, if we don't know how they're being hijacked, and if we're not thinking through whether they're being put to constructive ends, we're going to end in the conflicts and the disasters that we see all around us.
So we're being quite abstract. So what exactly do we mean by these needs and motivations, and how are we going to address them?
In politics, people tend to use terms such as identity or ideology more, rather than human needs. But in my view, there are, behind those terms, clear human motivations. The ones that play, all of what the human givens play some role in politics, but the ones I would highlight very much are, for example, for leaders and for people working in systems, status and attention are extremely important. Attention seeking is a hugely important process of need seeking in politics, whether through the media or otherwise. But for political groups, I think it goes beyond that. And this could be political parties, nations, etc. There, the natural innate needs for belonging and for purpose and meaning become very, very important. And in fact, also for achievement. For example, you can have many very extreme groups in the Middle East. I could name many. From Shia revolutionary groups to Jewish settler groups to Sunni radical fundamentalist groups. They permit their followers to have a very strong sense of achievement. The members of those groups are satisfied to some degree in getting their needs met. They're young men. They feel like they're getting things done. They have a sense of mission and purpose. And obviously, by belonging to these groups, they have a very strong sense of belonging. Now, I think the cases should be made that that's a very powerful set of human needs that are being met through groups whose ends should be and can be questioned. Nobody questions why these groups are successful.
Almost because that's not the point, is it? The point is that people are belonging to a tribe or a cell, and they're getting those needs met in that cell. So why on earth would they try and change that, or why would they try and talk to a different cell? It seems a conundrum that's almost insoluble.
I don't think it is insoluble, and here there may be some idealism speaking, but I think it's beyond that. I think we need to address these things because they are the front line, they're the friction point of conflict. Conflict is almost always the result of two things. Either that one group simply doesn't care about the needs of another group, ignores those needs in the interests of its own, or even worse, it has a desire to be supreme over another group. I do think, even though I'm not suggesting this will happen overnight, that a greater understanding of each other's needs, let's call it mutual needs, and the satisfaction of mutual needs, can mitigate conflict and possibly even prevent it.
So somebody has to provide them with a vision of a greater good.
Yes, but that would start somewhere else, which is a vision, or if you wish, an understanding of their own needs. Most people are not aware of what we're talking about. Most of the stuff looks to me, anyway, politically, like it's going on instinct. People are drawn to things politically without thinking much about it. They're just drawn to it. Oh, that's appealing. There could be a lot of factors going into that, but they just go for it. I do think the more explicit and reflective we become about these things, which is work, I have to admit, it does require effort, it requires learning, but I don't see any way around that, frankly, the less likely that we're going to fall into traps, the less likely that we're going to be manipulated into having our needs met through ends that possibly we don't agree with, but we've either been conditioned into agreeing for them, or we have no choice but to go that road. In other words, the more clarity we have about the most foundational elements that are driving us, the less likely we will be to be driven in the wrong direction.
But you only have to look in the school playground to see that human nature does what it does.
Yes.
There will be gangs. There'll be some gangs are more powerful than others, and the less powerful gangs will find ways of making them, their own survival in the corner of the playground. You're not going to change human nature, are you?
No, I don't think we can change human nature, but we can do two other things. And beyond those two things that I'll mention, I think there's another issue that's rather important and one for debate. The two things we can do is understand human nature. I don't think we have a very powerful understanding of human nature. Most people simply accept it and run with it. To me, that's not quite good enough, and I do think that if we look at a long-term process of evolution, we can see that human beings are trying to understand themselves and why they're here. So number one is to understand it.
Can we just take that first of all? And how do we do that? Through leadership, through some kind of vision, or
that's one way, definitely. The other way, I think, in a healthy culture, healthy cultures put these ideas out through many mechanisms, whether through books, whether through arts, whether through the development of certain habits inside a culture. The reason I think it's very important in politics is because not only is human nature abused in politics terribly, but also, if one thinks clearly about it, the political context, if it's not one that helps us understand these things, is going to help us go in the wrong direction. In other words, we all live in a political context, in a social political context. The more that context is aware of the need to do this, the better it's going to be.
So we're looking in the wrong place. We shouldn't look at politics at all. We need to look at music and the arts and sport.
Yes, it's very possible. I do think that the role of politics is exaggerated sometimes as the fix-all to all things, especially the role of the state. However, I don't mean to do this only in this direction, but quite often the negatives come out in the politics, as I was mentioning earlier, as unfortunately we see in the region that I know well, the Middle East, is that the abuse of the needs shows in politics. That doesn't mean, I don't think that the complete fix will come in politics either, but I do think that we can take on a do no harm principle in politics. That's already would be a very positive step. So the first step is understanding. The second one comes right after it, and that is automatically to know that just because I have these needs doesn't mean I should indulge with them ad infinitum and without limit. So the notion that these emotional motivations need some degree of management, putting a limit to them, is as important as the other. And frankly, in politics, that is extremely important, because actually the number of cases where these needs have been hijacked politically is endless. Endless. We can look at almost every country and see where that's been done. Now, you asked me earlier though, can we change human nature? So my answer is really no, we can't, but we can understand it better. But it seems to me that now we've hit a point in human development. Globalization, our ability to manage or use the sciences, even destructively, technology, has come to a point where I'm really not sure we have any choice but to begin a better understanding of ourselves. So for example, let's take a term like tolerance, which is bandied about. I come from Canada, and Canada is a relatively tolerant society. But I think we can also see that under stresses and pressures, tolerance will go out the window. I do think we're at a period of human development where if we don't begin to understand how more sustainable tolerance is developed, we're at an extremely high risk of more conflict and more destruction. Do I think it's possible? Absolutely. I actually do think we have a considerable upside. I think our capacity for learning and for taming these motivations of ours is high. But I'm not sure we either put in the effort, the time, the awareness. And I think we're there. We're at that point where we're going to have to begin to do that.
Do you think for the past 15 years almost that we have found that compromise is a bad word? Compromise means you don't really know what you think.
Sure.
You have to be able to pin your colours to the mast, and you have to have a very definite opinion.
Yep.
Nuance, compromise, not fashionable.
Polarization of politics, I think, is the most common term. Yes, and I think there are two reasons for it in my humble view. One is that the technology that we're using more and more to express ourselves politically, primarily digital technology, encourages that, because it encourages people to live in tiny little silos on their screen where they're mostly sharing opinions with other people who are like-minded.
So it's digital in all ways as opposed to analog.
Binary.
Yes, binary.
Exactly. That's one reason. But I think there's another one, it's not so hidden. I think it needs to be stated more clearly and more often, which is people love drama. They love high emotion. So polarization tends to do that.
And that's attention seeking.
Yes, and it's also a kind of high. I think people just get excited that they have such a strong view, that they know some truth, that they're on the, let's call it, the right side of things. I think that excites them. It brings drama to their life, because as soon as you're so much on the right side of things, well, then obviously somebody is opposed to you. And that opposition is also exciting, the sense of competition with others. And I don't think there's anything unhealthy about competition, by the way. It's just, I think I think you're stating, it's gone to almost ridiculous levels. And the reason I'm highlighting this is, again, this refers back to our relative ignorance about our emotional states. We can get very easily addicted to high emotional states. We do so politically all the time. It becomes a sports match, really. And if I look at American politics quite often, all I see is a sports event. You've got a red team and a blue team, and they're fighting it out, and the media's keeping score. And that's all they're really doing. The actual policy, meaning what practical, effective results are you going to get from A, B, or C, is a distant third, fourth, which is why you tend to get, I think, presidents possibly like Donald Trump getting elected, because he understands that political competition. He's instinctively sort of probably good at it, and people are drawn to him for that. Never mind whether this man can deliver the goods or can understand how to deliver the goods. That's not even on anybody's radar screen.
I've often thought it might be a much better idea, instead of wars, to have a big, massive game of chess on a neutral territory somewhere, and play the war out on a chessboard. Because, in terms of conflict resolution, the world we're living in now is beyond words, really.
Obviously, having worked on the Middle East, I've given a lot, and my work is conflict resolution. I've given this a bit of thought, and it's tricky territory. Because identity, people's cultural identity, is not something that should be easily played with. It is a tool for tribalism. It's also a tool for human contentment. We need it to be happy. We need to belong to cultures. We all belong in sort of fields of culture. Our families have habits within it. Our daily habits are within it. No one really is without culture, and that's really important. The other thing that I think we will never escape in terms of human nature is competition.
But you can harness that, and
exactly, tribes will compete, and I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I think it's actually a good thing.
It all depends on the board you're playing the competition on.
Yes, and I think there's one other dimension, and now that I think of it, it's almost like 3 C's: culture, competition, and in a way, but not conflict. Because how do you keep it at the competition level and not conflict? I think there has to be an enormous amount of education about how there's almost a tipping point between being let me say, a normal tribe and a tribe trying to be supreme over others. Now, I think there are mechanics to that, by the way. I think there's a lot of work on either cult behavior in human beings or the value systems that groups have and group behavior that people simply don't know about. And they don't know the traps of belonging to a group where, by the way, to go back to what we were saying earlier, you have your needs met. It's essential.
Because they don't need to look at anything else. That's working fine for them.
It is working fine for them, but there's a larger picture. There is a larger picture that they belong to. Right. The number one, there are, I think, two issues that are crucial. One is if you're in a very highly emotional state of any kind and whatever brings it on, you're not going to be able to see it. Because your focus is so intense on something that you're not going to look beyond it. The other is a bit trickier, but I think it's possible. And here I think my own experiences could be relevant. When we belong to groups, we tend to almost automatically diminish outsiders, the insider-outsider complex. There is some evidence, mostly through anthropological work, that the more you're exposed to other groups, the more you learn about your own, and see that in fact it's imperfect, even though you think it's the best. It's imperfect, has its limits, and that you do need to look beyond it in order to achieve something larger. That process is not easy, but for example, I come from multiple identities myself, and I've seen this among many people who travel a lot. When one does that, I think there is an automatic learning to put our own group in perspective. As soon as one sees it in perspective, I think it's automatically mitigated, this desire for supremacy. One final dimension to it. Leaders easily manipulate this. And people run off, like lemmings off a cliff with it. The more we're aware of how leaders do it and that they're doing it, the less likely we will be to fall into that trap.
Because another human givens thing is the pattern recognition and the need to almost compare yourself. Do you think that's an answer lies in that somehow, where you're seeing another group but seeing patterns that you can connect with?
Right. Yeah, I do. And in fact, Edward Hall, the very well-known American anthropologist, has said that his equation's a fascinating one. He says that cultures are essential to us. I'm paraphrasing what he says. We can't live without them. The problem is that our cultures get out of line with our needs. We don't change them very effectively. We don't have conscious cultural evolution. We kind of do it almost blindly and randomly. When that mismatch happens between our culture and our needs, people, according to him, they go crazy. So the only way to fix that, according to Hall, is to do comparative cultural testing, meaning to learn about other cultures to learn about our own. Right. It's too difficult to just learn your own. You need to look out, see something that you can relate to, which is what you mean by the pattern matching, and then change yours.
So we're talking about education, we're talking about schools.
Yes, very much so. Definitely. Yeah.
What's your opinion on the conflicts at the moment in the Middle East, Assad and Syria, Palestine, Israel, and also Myanmar and the Rohingya?
Well, they're all quite different, first of all, but
there must be some
similarities.
Patterns again.
I do think so. I think that in all those cases, unfortunately, you see one leader or one people insisting on supremacy over another. That can taste good to people because it means success, it means strength, it can mean pride. I don't think we're going to get anywhere until it becomes more commonly accepted that pride, that sense of supremacy, has to have a limit, and beyond it is a danger zone. And whether it's Syria and what's happened in Syria, or whether it's the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, or other conflicts, I mean, there are many in the Middle East other than that, I think that's what ties them together, is this tribal need to feel supreme. Sometimes it's not even a tribe. Sometimes, frankly, in some countries, it's a family that needs to feel supreme. There is a learning process ahead that we can belong to a tribe, to a group. We can have our needs met in that group, but we can do so only to a limit. And after that, you're doing damage. Ultimately, the damage is to yourself. You know, the people call him the first sociologist of history, an Arab from what was Tunis called Ibn Khaldun. And he talked about this in 600 years ago. He talked about what is in Arabic called asabiyi, which is a very profound sense of tribalism. And he described it as the instrument of success for a group. And it is in some ways, which is why we were talking about competition. But it is also the source of the group's downfall. Now, if you wish, we can accept that our history will be nothing but that, rise and fall of groups, competition between them, as we've seen throughout human history. Or we can try to mitigate that a little bit and see that our groups, our tribes, our nations can live together with competition. I don't think that'll ever go away, but with less violent conflict. Especially, frankly, given the resources that we have at hand now, what to do to each other, which is not minor.
Where are we going to find that enlightenment? Because that's what we need. I
think there's no way around one word, which is knowledge. There's just no way around it, because if you don't know something, if you don't recognize, that is the starting point. If you don't know that your group can be other than what you think it is, then you won't do anything about it. So the more knowledge there is out there about these things, the better. There's another way of looking at it, if you wish. It's kind of another form of education about our groups that I think is important. Ivan and Turrell and Joe Griffin have developed this notion that they've termed kaitextia, which means to be context blind. And they've developed that for about psychology, about individual psychology, whether autism or the other end of the spectrum, schizophrenia. And they've developed it about the left-right brain functioning. I've actually noticed, a bit before I've met Ivan and Joe, but their work has developed, again, helped me crystallize these ideas better, that all cultures have a form of kaitextia. All cultures are blind in some way to an aspect of reality. Some are considerably blind.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. And these are not just my ideas. A lot of, again, Edward Hall has done work on this. Psychologists have done work on this. Hall, for example, says there are cultures that are implicit cultures and others that are explicit. So, Western cultures, Western European cultures, the United States, Canada, have much more need to be explicit about things. They don't leave things implicit.
You mean like religious systems and things?
I think even simply, let's say you have a plan. You want to do something.
Policy.
Yeah, you need to actually express it and articulate it in extremely specific detail. Some Eastern cultures don't have that need. They'll express a plan, but to far less detail, and leave a lot more implicit. So those implicit cultures, when somebody walks into a room, socially the norms are understood. They don't have to be stated. That's why he describes it as an implicit culture. Ian McGilchrist, who's also done a lot of work in the left and right brain, also says that really you have left brain cultures and right brain cultures, and the problem with the world today is it's gone extremely left-brained. The reason I'm emphasizing this kaitexia, this context blindness in cultures, is that if cultures are blind, context blind to some degree or another, if I live this, by the way, every day because I work in an international environment. So when I'm dealing with a German, I realize sometimes I have to be much more explicit in instructions or in explaining something than if I'm dealing with an Arab, who will get it more implicitly. I'm a bit of a bridge because I'm both East and West, but as an example, quite often, those two cultures, when they meet, will completely talk beyond each other. They're not talking to each other directly.
There's a subtext.
And they're not getting it. this idea that the cultural gap is due to fundamental, almost brain function, which one is emphasized in each culture, isn't really out there sufficiently. The more knowledge every nation has, every culture has about its limits, the more it will understand that it needs to work with other cultures. So if German or an American culture are too left-brained, which I think they are, by the way, we can get into what that means. And conversely, Arab culture, for example, is more right-brained. Technically, you could see one day a world where they could understand that they're working together is actually very beneficial, because it's rare to have any culture that's truly in balance between right and left. Ian McGilchrist says there have been moments in Western civilization when that happened, which tend to be when you get that balance between left and right brain functioning, you get very highly creative and productive periods of history, the Renaissance, ancient Greece. But they're not that common. We're quite often out of balance, either within a culture or between cultures. So this kind of knowledge is another level of what is today, in my view, ignorance as to how cultures don't interrelate, how they can interrelate with each other. And by the way, this Itexia notion, unless you want to explore that a bit further about the cultural dimension, because this plays out in all sorts of other ways in politics that I can point out.
I was just going to say, am I barking up the wrong tree if I say it's more like layers? I was born in Ruislip, so I understand anybody who's born in that little suburban part of the home counties of London knows exactly where they come from, what kind of house they lived in, what their parents were probably, what their values were. I'm also a Londoner, sort of, and right. I'm a Brit, I'm a European, sure. I'm a member of the world, I'm a member of the... So there's layers, and there are understood principles in each of those layers.
I think that's completely correct. Completely. And in fact, it's funny you say this, because only yesterday I was talking to an Israeli who's mapping the various Jewish cultures in Israel regarding the Temple Mount, the holiest site, and how they all have very different value systems towards it. So it reflects on what you're saying. This is within Israel, among Jews in Israel. And I asked him whether there wasn't some larger Jewish meta-narrative that encompasses all of them. Fascinatingly, he told me, yes, that would be a story, which I think is really an accurate depiction, likely, of what does bind them all together. And by the way, I think this is a whole zone of international relations, of conflict resolution that's not sufficiently explored. Some people do work at stories, but they tend to be at the level of the individual, a refugee who suffered, etc. That's good. But I'm wondering for the future now whether the examination of conflict by a better understanding of the other through understanding their story isn't also potentially in the future a very powerful mechanism of maybe absorbing why they are who they are and why they're behaving that way in a much better way.
And again, maybe that would start in schools with children.
Yes. Now, I'm fated to work not with school and children, but with diplomats and
grown-up children.
Yes, thank you. I think that's very well put. They are grown-up children. We are grown-up children, but so the work with those people is a bit more difficult because successful people, which they tend to be, and very bright people, are quite often less open to learning than children. So yes, I think ideally that is the way to do it. But to go back to your point, I think we all live a series of fields of culture. There's no doubt about that. And I'm not trying to oversimplify by giving, putting it all into one national field for everybody. But I also think it's wrong to simply ignore the national field. There's a tendency these days to do that, to use, I think, what's called identity politics, to constantly break things down, to almost fragment them into the needs of an ever more reductive individual. That, I'm not saying that's untrue, by the way. I think every individual is quite unique. But we also live in larger fields. I think to deny that is also to live in a completely atomized world that's completely fragmented. And how do we relate to each other? We need these fields to relate in. The point I guess I'm saying about conflict resolution, international relations, is that there's a lot more work ahead than classical diplomacy, which is more oriented towards statecraft, in having nations understand each other along these lines, rather than simply along the lines of letting the states deal with each other at an interest level. I have a feeling that's run its course. I mean, that's a bold statement, meaning I don't mean that state-driven, interest-driven transactional politics are dead. No, they're very much alive. I'm saying they're insufficient. We need to add many other layers of knowledge.
And there are many overlaps as well. Maybe there's a way of looking at, I'll relate to somebody in the Middle East who will have a totally different background from me, but is the same age as me, maybe has children my age, maybe at my children's age, maybe has grandchildren, maybe has, there'd be things that we would relate to each other on that can totally nothing to do with our cultures, but to do with who we are as human beings.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I've noticed, because I travel so much, that there's something people don't pay enough attention to, which is that beyond identity, people can relate to each other. It's often, if I can call it, silent or invisible. It's just there. The problem is, as soon as we speak, we're speaking in another language. As soon as we point to culture, we're speaking about another culture. But I dare say that commonality is still there. Yes, I think you've pointed out to some of the elements that are always there. Children, family, they're always there, and one can relate to them. Humor, people like to music. These are things that I think are cross-cultural automatically. But there is almost what I describe as a silent recognition between human beings. I agree with that, and I think people probably don't spend enough time becoming aware of it when they meet people, or it's a glancing thing. So much of the work ahead politically is to stop or diminish the amount of behavior patterns that get in the way of that more simple recognition.
And the noise gets louder and louder around us, doesn't it?
It's the ideology, the polarization, the tribal behavior, the excessive emotion. All of that is it's not noise, but if you wish, it's noise compared to that silence. That diminishing those behavior patterns, including, by the way, and I think this goes back to our early conversation, a basic admission that we like to feel supreme. I think, you're not going to stop being supreme or trying to be supreme over others until you admit that you're doing it.
We feel safer when we're supreme. We feel in charge.
Yes, and we assume it, you see. And I think this is what I see a lot in my work, is that a lot of people just simply assume that they should do that. That there's nothing really wrong with it, although they know that there's something wrong with it. But none of that is ever truly questioned, or I would say possibly not questioned sufficiently, or to make people realize that A, it's not the only way to be, B, they're doing enormous damage to others. By the way, sometimes they don't care, but I think that is psychopathic sphere, when you really don't care what you're doing to others. That takes us to another zone of learning, by the way, in politics, which is, I think the average citizen still has a long way to go, in a democracy or not, by the way, in differentiating between a leader that they're attracted to and a leader that they're attracted to who's psychopathic. I don't think people make that differentiation. They just go with their attraction. That's not enough, because it's ultimately a danger for the citizen themselves. What is that leader going to do to them in a war, in a conflict? These basic, frankly, I would call them even basic political skill set. They're not taught. Nobody knows how to make these differentiations. Nobody knows to be aware or awaken to the fact that a leader is manipulating them. Or how. I mean, Ivan Tyrrell, I think, does a fabulous job of demonstrating how leaders can put their audience into basically a hypnotic state, from where they can put anything into their brains that they want.
Crowd behavior, I suppose, is it?
Exactly. How many people are aware of that? Very few. And sadly, we're not just talking about the Hitlers and the clear psychopaths who still, by the way, managed to move a nation of dozens of million in a very destructive direction. We're talking even about more
subtle
forms of manipulation, which may not lead to destructive wars, but can lead to poor policy, to doing nothing, to being absorbed in abstractions rather than actually in the function of government. Yes, it's a massive educational process.
And how are you carrying that on? What's your next move?
Well, I and others, including Ivan Tyrrell and other colleagues, have created something called the Conciliators Guild. It's called the Conciliators Guild because we aim to gather as many people as possible working in international relations, diplomacy, policy, who support this kind of learning process. We do so in two ways, really. One is through courses, like literally going out and talking to people, educating, training. The other is newer now, and we're just beginning to test this out. It goes back to a term I used before, which is about mutual needs satisfaction, except we're not using exactly that term. In the Middle East itself, which is not easy, but I actually see interest there. We are discussing with policymakers, with experts there, the need for a term called mutual regional security. We all know the Middle East is actually a security disaster. The parties there almost do nothing except inflame their security situation on the premise that they're taking care of their security situation. So our premise is, tell us more clearly what your security needs are, your basic needs, not your wishes. And let us work with you to see how they can be met in other ways. And, by the way, your neighbor also has security needs. And we're hoping that by showing the collective set, by having them understand their needs better, because half the problem is they don't even think in these terms. The other half is how they get their needs met. Like an individual who's not getting their needs met properly in their lives causes a lot of trouble. It's a heavy lift. I'm not pretending it's not. It's complex, but it's also potentially a huge learning experience for them and for us. And in other words, this is the more practical attempt to implement learning in the Middle East on a live issue. It will also touch on some of the more intangible dimensions of national needs. A foreign minister in the Middle East has put forward the idea for the need of what's called a cognitive map of the region. Now, this is an official, a very senior official. Do the countries in the region understand each other of what their stories are? How they value themselves, what their fears and concerns are. All this, in my view, will go back to basic human needs in the end.
It has to, doesn't it, really?
There's a drill down back to that. I think it's unavoidable. It's unavoidable. It's bedrock. Because all of these political constructs, these cultural attitudes, are built on something. There's something below them, driving them. So basically, at the Conciliators Guild, our job is to help practitioners and others understand those more hidden drivers better. And it is literally a translation of the human givens ideas, and many others, by the way, at the more group level, which the human givens doesn't attend to as much because it's about individual psychotherapy or individual understanding of human needs. Translation of all that into the political sphere. And it really is a learning process. It's not as if we have a silver bullet and here we are, and it's because it's new, and all new things are learning processes, I think, by definition. So it'll be formed by our own learning and the learning of those people that we deal with.
And it does sound one hell of a heavy lift, but
it is a heavy lift.
Look forward to hearing more about it,
yeah.
And wish you all the very best with it.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.